All right, hello everyone. We're going to be continuing our study of Hannah Arendt today with a defense of Little Rock. But before we get started, this is just a reminder that all of Reddit today is just a hive mind craziness. That if you don't agree with what the hive mind says, you're not allowed to get published and you're not allowed to post on Reddit. You're not allowed to say anything that neoliberal intersectionality doesn't already agree with. All right, so let's take a look at a defense of Hannah Arendt's Little Rock. Now, before we get started, again, I might have mentioned this before, but Hannah Arendt was highly critiqued by the Jewish community for being so powerful in her critique by realizing the complicity of the rabbis who were working together with Nazi Germany to make lists, to get people to stand in lines, to get people to go on the trains. Those rabbis that Hannah Arendt called out in her work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the rest of her work, why she was called a self-hating Jew is the exact same reason why she's called a sexist by feminists and why she's called or a pick-me woman, is what the feminists call it now, by the feminists, and a racist by the constantly traumatized intersectional people. Now, for this situation, let's really take a look at, and I was going to show, change my view about on Reddit, and you can see that everything that's allowed to be on Reddit, is one that is participates in the platform strawman culture. So, for example, you have Reddit men writing women, right? You have this subreddit dedicated to showing how men cannot write women. But when you don't platform straw men, when you give the best example of men writing women, what happens? What was that lady's name? 3 men awarded for Women's Writer Award. What's that? Giorgio Diaz, Augustin, and Antonio Mercier, all accomplished writers in their own right. They had a fake person named Carmen Mola. Okay? So what happens when men actually write women? We have someone like Carmen Mola gets the Women's Writers Award. So this is the opposite of men writing women. And this culture of strawmanning, platforming strawman, is created out of the collective, constantly traumatized, historical traumatized, this inability to deal with our own amygdalic thinking, right? As capitalist Kemp mentality of turning all human social relationships into capitalist cost-benefit analyses of privilege and emotional labor that feminism, that intersectionality imposes upon us. In fact, if we aren't doing that kind of transactional relationship, if we aren't having a transactional relationship with regards to our communities, with regards to it's too much emotional labor culture to educate you, that kind of culture, it's been normalized by the sociality that feminism has indoctrinated into us, in Canada at least, since we are children. Intersectionality is basically the religion of Western imperialism now, where you have the CIA also repeating this stuff, you have the American Psychological Association repeating this stuff, and basically Trump accelerated this neoliberal colonization of the mind. And so, if you have a good example of conversation culture, a public sphere, you wouldn't have something like Are Men Writing Women? Are Men Writing Women would be the best examples instead of the worst examples, right? The worst examples, she touched her nipple and vibrating. I mean, it's just, there's so many examples of bad men writing women, but this subreddit could have just as easily been a non-platforming strawman culture. But you can see that censorship culture creates a culture where we are constantly putting the other side down. We give the worst examples of the other side. And the right does this, the left does this. But the thing is, I don't expect much from the right. I expect from the academic left, I expect them to not be strawmanning. But because of affirmative action culture, for the last 50 years, we've had and combined with the capitalist publisher die culture, we've had just an excessive amounts of shitty writing in academia. All these writings that repeat hive mind literature stuff in order to get published. So you cannot even get published if you don't, repeat the idioms. So you got to repeat the idioms. That way you can get published. That way you won't get canceled off of subreddits. You won't get, if you are somebody who is constantly virtue signaling, is constantly doing what the intersectionality movement wants you to do. Now, the deeper thing that we're trying to do here is talk about how this is bad for democracy, how this is bad for the real working class, the masses of working classes that are not voting for leftist imperialist politics today. So that's the introduction to this. And one of the things that I have to say is there's a difference between racism from ignorance and a racism from hate. Now, we are dealing with racism from hate, but because there's no distinction between racism from ignorance and racism from hate, because the people who are, constantly worried about racism are the collective historical traumatized people, this vicariously traumatized people too, because, you read something on the internet, oh, I can't walk home at night because I'm a woman, blah, blah, blah. All that kind of stuff is basically self-fulfilling prophecy. They become self-fulfilling prophecies. And these self-fulfilling prophecies of intersectionality, are very important to maintain, because that's what upholds the system of white supremacy. And you don't have to follow me in saying this. You can go to Are Black Women, the Reddit for Black women. They have a question. So if you go on Are Black Women hypergamy, if I search why so many women are deciding to level up, okay, so it becomes a white supremacist act, and it's a white supremacist act done by colored people. And you can see so many colored people, Asians and black people, whatever your color is, we are in a situation where we worship white men, and that's actually confounded. It's done again by what? By a culture that forces us to always commodify all of our human social relationships. So if you commodify all your human social relationships, it's like, should I have a colored baby or should I have a whiter baby? Well, the answer is absolutely clear, right? And this is if and one of the things of the manosphere is don't listen to what they do, look at what they say. Don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. And what are they doing in actuality, in our everyday rituals? In our everyday rituals, we are upholding capitalism, we are upholding white supremacy, and in our words, in our presentation culture, we have black Cinderellas and colored people everywhere, but in reality, we are all worshiping white people, and we are all worshiping people who have the most privilege, the people who have the most capital. And how is this movement created, right? So yes, I'm a gold digger. A discussion on hypergamy 4 years ago. This is a cultural problem, and it's a cultural problem that exists in certain communities, right? Historically, poor people have had the collective power of poor people came from their families and their communities. So it was imperative to destroy the community, to destroy the family, to destroy those poor working communities. And how did they do that? With the corporate people, they became feminists, so that they destroyed the poor families, they destroyed the solidarity in poor families, and what happens is we live in a culture that worships privilege at every turn. So why do we have this culture? It's because intersectionality cannot be critiqued. You cannot blame. So whereas Hannah Arendt is doing the hard work of doing complicity, of talking about complicity in her work, what the intersectional people do is they are complicit in their actions, and in their words they say otherwise. So because they have this Butlerian presentation culture that they enforce on everybody. And in fact, if you are not participating in this enforcement of this, like for example, this Be Kind movement. The Be Kind movement, right? The Be Kind movement is so evil. It's so absolutely evil, right? It's absolutely really evil, because what it does is you can be kind while you are exploiting people, while you are upholding white supremacy, while you are doing all things. At least be kind, all right? And this is because we live in, again, because we live in a culture that imposes intersectionality at every turn. Now, one of the things I need to talk about is the difference between those two types of racism. I just talked about ignorant racism and hatred racism. And yeah, we are dealing with a hatred racism. So how can we deal with that hatred racism, right? So there is a big difference between cultural critique and being racist. There's a big difference between cultural critique and being racist. So for example, one of the big thing I can think of is like my experiences in mainland China, right? If I'm in mainland China, there's so many cultural critiques that I could be having, right? There's a lot of like problematic cultural things, and that arises out of a history of collective trauma, of famine, all of these issues that China is coming out of, and those kinds of collective historical traumas need to be talked about, and how to be talked about that is through cultural critique. And funnily enough, mainstream or just Chinese people in general are very open to these. That's a positive thing, right? Same thing with other cultures in Islam. We should be able to critique, this Burkini culture or whatever. But instead, because we assume that intersectionality is commensurate with all the sectionalities are commensurate with one another, that is a lie. We assume that intersectionality is secular, which is complete lie. So the lie here, the Straussian understanding, if you follow my Leo Strauss series that's coming, one of the big points is that whereas the left has painted the home as being this ideal of the home as being a non-economic space, or the ideal of the temple as being a non-economic space, is a lie. Well, there is a lie. So it's always been economic. So we're not doing emotional labor calculations. It's always been economic. That's the insanity of the left today. Well, there's actually a lie even before that, and the lie even before that is that there is a separation between theology and the secular, which there never was. All of our institutions, the Crown, all of our institutions have a theological aspect to them. And in fact, if you read people like Kant, right, the Kant's Copernicus revolution was all about that. In fact, what's happening now in the Harvard University is they're releasing papers about how Kantianism is like a emotional issue. It's actually real. And if you look at my video called Unwitting Colonizers, you can take a look at why the takeover of psychology by intersectionality was so necessary, because psychology is what is basically, they're making the laws for us. The true psychologists in our society, as I've been arguing, the true psychologists in our society are the service workers, the cashiers, the people who are actually dealing with frontline, even not social workers. Social workers get paid enough. Even before you find the social worker, even before you find the psychologist, there are fucked up people. And those fucked up people, who are they dealing with? They are dealing with the cashiers, the service people in our society. They are the real psychologists in our society, are the service people, the ones who are actually taking on that emotional labor while they're getting paid $10 an hour, $8.50 an hour, whatever the minimum wage is. Those are the real psychologists in our society. Whereas the so-called psychologists in our society, the ones that get affirmative action positions, first of all, then reiterate affirmative action ideology. They repeat affirmative action ideology. What do they do? They're the people who are getting paid by they're the people that are getting paid by Mark Zuckerberg and all these tech companies to get us addicted to apps. So the people who are trying to come up with good policy solutions are the same people, the American Psychological Association people, who are also getting paid to get us addicted to those apps, right? Whereas the real psychologists in our society are the service workers, are the people who get paid less than $50,000 a year. Those are the real psychologists in our society. Social workers do a lot of work as well, but those psychologists and social workers are working in a field that is after, like, those are people who actually want to seek help, right? There's a whole swath of people that don't even get into social work, that don't even get into getting psychology, unless, like, they did something criminal and then they have to do it. And even there, if you go to, like, the prison system in Canada, where people need actual psychological help, what do they get instead? They get the Duluth model. They get the same propaganda that we've been indoctrinated by since childhood in this country. We've been indoctrinated by the same propaganda since childhood, and that's because all the teachers, they all go to OISE. They all are part of this socially reproduced culture. And one of the big things, right, just as Hannah Arendt makes a cultural critique of the Jewish cultural, rabbinic critique that, opened the floodgates to make, Nazi Germany more efficient with their destruction of this, or this genocide, or ethnocide, whatever, Holocaust, whatever you want to call it. That complicitness on the rabbi part, is very important for Jewish, collective historical trauma healing. But we don't get this same thing within the intersectional literature, because they have this noble savage, do not blame the victim ideology, when really, if you look at my history, my great-great-great-grandfather, sold us off into serfdom or something. One of my grandfathers was a serf and the other one. So that is very important to see who was the person who sold you off into slavery. Was it a white man? Was it a white man? The white man was the slave master, was also your great-great-great-grandfather, because he's the one who, forced himself onto and those are just incredibly difficult, and the left that's always calling about nuance. They have no nuance in the left. They're the ones that keep continuing to repeat the same ideologies. So then on Reddit, you had some people talk about how, when some people are talking about black people in America, right? They're talking about certain areas, right? They're talking. So this was someone on Reddit that said this about how racism. People aren't actually racist. They're just talking about the culture in these areas. That is even seen as racist. But who sees that as racist? The academics who have never actually left their ivory tower. Those academics that have never actually left their ivory tower, go hang out in South Chicago for a little while. Have you ever been in South Chicago? I was in South Chicago, right? There were 14-year-old kids with guns threatening me. With guns! I'm already afraid of teenagers without guns, right? These 14, I'm walking around, South Chicago because I'm a stupid hippie. I don't realize, that there's like I feel like I'm not white, so I should be fine, but it's not about your race. That's the funny thing, right? In South Chicago, it's not even about your race. It's about the fact that you're there, right? It's a question about you being there, you being in that neighborhood. It doesn't matter even if I have no money, I look poor, it doesn't matter if you look poor. You are there. It's not about race for the guys in the 12-year-old kid in South Chicago. It's not about race for the fact that I was there. Dude, they're pulling out their guns. These 14-year-old, 15-year-old kids, they're showing me their guns. I'm passing by. They're yelling slurs at me. Hey, what the fuck is this guy doing here? I don't know. I can't remember what they said. They were just like, hey, fuck you. And they're just like yelling shit at me. I'm like walking. I take a left, they take a left. I take a right, they take a right. I'm on my way to visit the University of Chicago, where one of my friends is chilling. I've hitchhiked to Chicago. I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to see the city by walking to South Chicago. I'm going to walk there, or walk to the University of Chicago. And I get to Martin Luther King Street. Oh man, if you get to a Martin Luther King Street so there's a difference, right? So there is an actively valid cultural critique that should be had, but that doesn't take away the fact that there are redlining, there are systematic racist things that are happening. But the funny thing here is the systematic racism stuff is being blended into the cultural critique. So we cannot have a cultural critique anymore because that's part of the systematic racism. No, there needs to be a little bit of what the left is always calling for is nuance. No, we need cultural critique of the Jewish people who, blindly followed the rabbis. What am I talking about with that? If you don't know what the story is, people would escape the ghettos in Nazi Germany. They would escape the ghettos and the concentration camps or whatever, and they would come to the train yard where other Jews are getting on board to get on the train, and they would warn people, "Hey, don't get on the train. They're going to send you to a death camp. They're going to send you to a ghetto. Watch out. Don't go there." And you know what the rabbis would say? This guy's crazy. This guy needs mental health help. Just like what what is happening now. I'm at the intersectionality train. I'm like, "Hey guys, don't get on the intersectionality train. It's a white supremacy train. It's a neoliberal train." And who's calling me out? The leaders of our current situation. So thank you for following along on my Hannah Arendt critique. We're going to be reading this paper and getting at the root issues of what Hannah Arendt was really trying to say in her paper, rather than, and in contrast, we have here Catherine Gines on the Negro question, a really good work, a really in-depth work, a really nice academic work, but completely misses the point. Catherine Gines' work and critique on Hannah Arendt is very meticulous, very academic. But after reading this work, I realized it's all just this constant amygdalic thinking. It's an inability to slow down and take a deep breath. And why is that? Is because of collective historical trauma, right? Even though Catherine Gines has written an amazing work on Hannah Arendt, at the end of the day, when I slept on it, when I thought about it, I realized that it's just this amygdalic camp mentality operating, once again, overthinking of academia, in academia that happens, that is, funny enough, making us unable to really think. Reminds me of what Hannah Arendt was saying about Goebbels or Eichmann. Eichmann was an incredibly intelligent person. He was an academic. He could cite every article. He could cite every legal paper. But just like Catherine Gines, he's not actually able to think. He's not actually able to have philosophy, to do the deeper thinking. Hannah Arendt was not an academic. She was an intellectual. And what do I mean by that? Hannah Arendt was wrong about 99% of empirical things. And maybe I'll do a series on Martin Heidegger and the Black Books. She was wrong about Martin Heidegger and the Black Books and about Eichmann, about so many different things. She was wrong, empirically. But here's why she's an intellectual. Even though she's wrong about 99% of the empirical things, guess what? The philosophy still holds. The logic of the philosophy, the ideological critique that she does still holds. So her critique against Eichmann might have failed to work against Eichmann, but it still works for the next guy up the chain. So what was the critique against Eichmann? It was the banality of evil. That Eichmann was able to do all these things, but he couldn't actually think. But it turns out that Eichmann had an ideology. He knew what he was talking about. This is afterwards. So he was completely aware of the ideology itself. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. Maybe it didn't apply to Eichmann, but it did apply to the guy next, maybe not Eichmann, maybe not the next guy, maybe not the next guy, but at some point down the train, it does apply to the truck driver who's just like, whatever, I'm just going to be driving these Jews into their camp, That guy is the cog in the machine. So she did have a wonderful critique. So thank you for taking the time to look at this. We're going to be looking at a lot of different papers talking about Hannah Arendt and the Negro question and the Jewish question. And that's why it's called the Negro question, this book. And whether Arendt, regardless of empiricality, is a racist or not. Because in the international literature, she's racist, she's sexist, she's all the isms, but in reality, intersectionality is the one that is constantly traumatized and doesn't have the ability to think. Just like my critique with FD signifier coming out. And I think I'm going to put that on Patreon because there's a lot of really difficult things that I talk about in my critique against FD signifier. Not that it's ever going to be seen by anybody because I'm banned anyway. So please like and subscribe and follow along on my critique of insanity culture today. Peace.